If you don't have enough book calls on the calendar, the easiest thing you can implement to double or even triple the volume of calls is a minimum viable calendar. And if you don't have a full sales calendar, this video is going to be exactly what you need to see in order to grow and scale to the next level. In this video, we're going to be talking about the difference between call booked funnels and using things like direct to calendar, video sales letters, even Google Doc sales pages. But most importantly, I'm going to introduce you guys to something we use for almost all of our clients that we call the minimum viable calendar. And it's fair to say that we've repeatedly, across a variety of different clients, some businesses doing under $1 million a year, some doing multiple millions of dollars a year, that have installed this minimum viable calendar and immediately seen a doubling, a tripling, and in some cases, even a 5x or a 10x in terms of the amount of volume of calls that get booked. So strap in, this is going to be a fun episode. If you're new to the channel, all we talk about is getting past 100K months to those multiple six figures and getting to that first 100K month if you're not there yet. Now, quick earnings disclaimer, we don't make any earning promises or anything like that. We don't even know who you are or what business that you've got, so we're in no way promising that you're going to get any returns from watching these videos. We just do them for education purposes and to show our clients exactly what we're doing inside of this process with people inside of Media Firestorm. So if you're coming back to the channel as a subscriber, welcome back, and let's get into the video. It's going to be a banger of a video today. We're here out in the garden again. I'm sweating. There's no AC outside in Costa Rica, but hopefully we'll be able to do a great video for you guys today. All right, so let's talk about this concept of the minimum viable calendar. Now, the first thing that I want to talk to you guys about is the concept of friction in your call booking funnel. And when I say friction, what I mean is the amount of steps or effort that you're putting in between your prospect coming in and booking a call or not booking a call. Remember, everything we're talking about today is in relation to call funnels, getting more calls into the calendar for your business. Now, when we first got started a couple years ago with Media Firestorm, and we just were rolling out our beta offer for the very first time, we had absolutely no friction whatsoever. So if we go back all the way to 2023, for the first 4 months in the business, what we did was, because we were launching, we just wanted to get as many people onto calls as possible. We weren't being fussy. We didn't even know if the offer was going to sell yet. So what we started off with was direct to calendar. And so we had an email that would go out to a customer, right? We had an email list of about 6,000 people. We would then send them an email, and we were doing about one email a day. And then in that email, we would say, hey, if you want to get booked on podcasts, book a call. We've got this new thing. It's called Media Firestorm. It's just dandy. You'll love it. And we would get people to book in direct on the calendar. Now, that calendar, I think we used Calendly at the time was the tool that we used. And it didn't really have anything on it. It was just, book a meeting, right? And we asked people for times. I think we had a calendar that was available for 7 days, and that's actually not something we recommend anymore. But it was just a basic calendar. I don't even think we asked any questions. And when we got started, that worked great. And we were able to get, quite a lot of revenue coming in those first couple of months. I think we were able to do $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a month pretty consistently for 4 months in a row, just selling this new thing to this list of people that we'd already developed from our previous business. And so this is pretty normal. If you launch something new and you got a bunch of people that you've never sold it to before, you're always going to see a big increase in sales in the beginning. But what happened over the period of those 4 months is that we started to notice that the sales conversion started to drop. So in the beginning, in month 1 and in month 2, we had like a 20 and a 30% close rate. And at the time, I was taking sales calls. And then as we got into month 3 and we got into month 4, we actually noticed that the sales rate dropped. We actually got down to 15 and even 10%. And we also brought on a salesperson inside of this process, and they were struggling, to make sales. And so one of the things that we heard from the salesperson was that we were having a lot of non-fit people. So what did we decide to do? We decided to add friction to the process. And so what we did now is that we had our 8,000 people that are on the list, because I think we'd added a whole bunch more people to the list at that point. And instead of sending an email that was actually sending people straight to a calendar, we sent people to a Google Doc. And that Google Doc acted as a sort of sales page. It was around about 22 pages long. We had a bunch of GIFs and fun things in it. And basically what it did was it pre-sold people. It was an extra step for people to go through, not only to get more interest in our process, but also at the same time to qualify people. It pushed away the wrong people and it got the right people coming in. Now, when we added in that extra level of friction, one of the first things that happened is call volume dropped because we went from straight into the calendar as many people as possible, and then we had this drop in bookings because we were quite rightly pushing people away to increase the quality. So we had probably about a third as many calls, but our close rate improved and it was a higher quality of prospect. And so what we did was we, increased the quality so that we had a higher number of calls, and then we went and pushed it forward again. Now, as we continue to grow the business, as we continue to get to this next level, at that point we were booking about 40 or 50 of these very highly qualified calls because they were going through this freaking 22-page Google Doc, but then we needed more volume, right? We wanted to turn things up. One of the things that we did was we increased marketing, but we also shifted back to something with a little bit less friction. This is where we introduced what we call the minimum viable calendar. And that minimum viable calendar was a little bit of a combination between what we were doing in the Google Doc and what we were doing before with direct to calendar. And so in this video, a little bit later, I'm going to help you guys understand exactly what that minimum viable calendar process looks like. But what we were able to find with the minimum viable calendar, we were able to get a higher frequency of people coming through and actually booking a call, and yet we were still able to maintain the quality of those prospects. So it's a little bit like the best of both worlds. We were able to get an increased throughput of calls that were booking. We were able to get up to 80 to 120 calls that were booking on the same amount of traffic, but the quality remained high. We were still getting these 20 and these 25% close rates inside of the sales process. And so that minimum viable calendar is what I want to talk to you guys about today. But I first want to help you guys understand this concept of friction. And essentially what you want to look at it is this: the more friction that you have inside of a process, right? If this is a low amount of friction and this is a high amount of friction, when you have a low amount of friction, you're typically going to have a higher volume of calls, right? But as you add friction, you're going to notice that the quality of those calls increases, but the volume drops. And so what you always have to assess when you're deciding, well, what do I need to use in my call funnel? You first have to look at how full you are. The question is, are you maxed out on your calendars? And if you aren't maxed out on your calendars, then what we need to do is we need to figure out how to increase volume. The other thing that we want to factor in is our close percentage. Now, if you have a very high close percentage, 25, 30, 35, 40% plus close rates, which is above industry average of about 20%, then there's a really good chance that you can lower the friction in the sales process and increase the volume. And what we're looking to do here is just net benefit, get you more calls on the calendar and close more deals without sacrificing the quality. And so what I'm going to talk to you about here today is not only how you can reduce friction and increase volume, but also actually maintain the quality at the same time. And we'll talk about some of the differences between VSLs, minimum viable calendars, and actually how you can incorporate both of these together, especially if you're doing multi-six-figure months. And this is one of the key things that we're doing as a business that's doing, a couple million a year, is actually adding in more than one conversion mechanism to get more people coming across the line. So let's first of all talk about the difference between a minimum viable calendar and a VSL. And so if you're watching this video, I'm assuming you know what a video sales letter is, right? It's a sales page where you get someone to watch a video, usually somewhere in the region of 8 minutes to 20 minutes. And the goal is to pre-sell somebody. Now, if you're in the relationship space, these VSLs can sometimes sound a bit like sob stories, right? Have you lost your wife? It's really difficult for you. I'm sure you're having a really hard time, right? To business owners with doing VSLs, which can vary quite wildly. Some video sales letters are very direct to the point. One of my mentors that has a VSL literally screams at people in the first 2 minutes, actually in the first 2 seconds, what the price is. He's like, it's $10K a month, right? And then there are other VSLs that actually try and sell you a little bit further. Point being, the VSL funnels that people are using is a high friction funnel. It's a funnel that has a lot of friction in it, and it's designed to pre-sell people, or it's designed to repel people. Not all VSL funnels are actually trying to sell you. A lot of VSL funnels are just adding friction because they only want the highest quality of prospect to come through. And that's another important concept to consider here. Now, a VSL, you typically will see these converting at between anywhere from 3% to 10% in terms of depending on the market. This will depend on if you're running cold traffic to it with cold emails or cold ads, as well as if you're coming from more warm traffic channels like podcast interviews or something like that. Now, a minimum viable calendar, these can actually perform anywhere from 10 to 40% throughput. Our current minimum viable calendars are actually routing calls through at a 36% throughput rate, which means if people land on it, 36% of the people actually go through that funnel and land on the back end and book a call, which is phenomenal. So again, we want to talk about these two differences. So the VSL, high friction, the minimum viable calendar, low friction, right? You're literally going to come in, and you're going to be selecting a time on the calendar. Now, one of the things that I want to explain to you about the difference between these two different types of funnels for a call booking funnel is the way that they sell. A video sales letter uses what I call front-end selling. And so you're going to come in, and most of the time with the VSL, you're going to be telling people what the offer is. You're going to be telling them about the outcomes that you generate, and you're essentially selling them on your process in the front end. And so typically a video sales letter will spend 8 minutes to 20 minutes trying to sell you on the benefit of booking a call. And why do they do that? Well, when you're going to come in and you're thinking about buying a product, you're going to have varying levels of interest. At the first level of interest, you're probably just going to be curious, right? You're just coming in and you're kind of thinking, well, what the hell is this? I saw an ad about it. And then as you go further into the sales process, you may get, kind of interested, right? You're actually more than curious, but you're really not showing a lot of level of interest here. You're like, okay, well, this actually makes a little bit more sense to me. And as you go further along into the process, you're actually, really interested. And then finally, right towards the end, you have convicted, right? And at this point, when you're right at the end, that's when you're actually going to be buying. And so the purpose of any of these front-end call booking funnels should be to take somebody from a level of curious as far up the ladder as they can, so that when you get onto the sales call, it's an easy slam dunk deal. You're actually helping somebody just to decide whether to move forward or not, rather than having to do a lot of selling on that call and educating on that call to just get them from a place of being curious to actually interested in the product. Because usually we find this zone here, right? There's very few, if not any, sales that happen in this zone. You actually have to get people all the way up into this convicted zone. They have to really believe that it's actually going to work for them to buy and become a customer. And so as much of that you can do on the front end is going to help you in the back end. That's why when we introduced this big Google Doc with 23 pages in it that said a lot about our process, we saw an increase in close rate because the people that were getting onto the call had more levels of interest. They were not just curious. They were either kind of interested, really interested, or full-blown convicted after reading what we went through. And so a VSL does a lot of this selling on the front end, right? It's on the VSL, and then it goes to a thank you page, right? Now, what we do with the minimum viable calendar is that we sacrifice selling on the front and we focus on selling on the back instead. And so why do we do this? Well, with the minimum viable calendar and the way we set this up, what we want to do is we want to benefit from the increased throughput that you get by having less friction on the front end. And then we use a lot of back-end conversion systems to warm people up before they get onto the call anyway. And so what we're looking to do inside of this process is to have a little bit of a best of both worlds, where you're actually getting people being pre-sold and excited about working with you without sacrificing people on the front end of the process, still getting as many people through to booking a call as possible. Now, when you do it this way, you do tend to get a little bit of drop off, right? You do have some cancellations that come through, but overall, you're still getting a net benefit, because if you're getting 2 to 3 times the booking rate and you're having maybe 30% of people that cancel calls, you're still net benefit getting a lot more. For example, if we were booking 40 calls before and now we're booking 120, even if we get 36 of those calls that cancel, we're still net positive, right? We got like 95 calls versus the 40 that we had before, right? And so overall, we're looking for that increase. So I'm going to talk through the components of the minimum viable calendar and really just help you guys understand this. Now, I'm not going to give you any examples. I'm not going to give you any help in terms of setting up the specifics of what to say or how to put the copy in place. If you want the help, you can get that help inside of Media Firestorm. This is our 12-month program where we help people to not only get booked on top 1% podcasts to get more earned media and more traffic for free, but we also help you install systems like this to help you get more sales and more conversions. And fundamentally, we help you to do more marketing and to be able to spend more money and time on marketing so that you can grow the business. Now, if you want to find out more details about Media Firestorm, you can click the link down below inside of the description, and you'll find out all about our top 1% podcast network, how we do 2 calls a week inside of that program. You get one-on-one access to me inside of our community, as well as access to some of the events that we're doing, usually 3 or 4 times a year, sometimes here in Costa Rica, sometimes in America. So if you're interested in getting some more of the specifics, some of the examples, as well as help and guidance from me making this real for you inside of your business, check that out down below. So let's go through some of the components of this minimum viable calendar. So when I say minimum viable calendar, I'm talking about just straight into your calendar software. So it doesn't matter whether you use Calendly, if you use the Google Calendar, if you use Go High Level, it doesn't matter. What we're optimizing for here is making sure that whichever calendar tool that we use, it has a higher front-end throughput than just a standard video sales letter funnel. So the first thing that I always say before you make any changes or install something like this in your business is that you need to measure. You should know what your metrics are for your current call funnel before you actually come in and do this. Now, if you're already using a calendar or if you're using some other type of funnel or whatever it is that you're using, measure it first. We want to make sure that we're testing against data points, not feelings. And a lot of the time, when we have people coming in and we get them to measure how their funnel is usually performing, most people have between 3 to 5% throughput, which is usually very easy to fix with one of these calendars. Now, one little caveat that I want to mention is whatever tool that you use, make sure you integrate that tool with some kind of analytics. If you're using Go High Level, right, it's probably got some analytics built in there. If you're using Calendly, the default analytics in that tool don't really give you any context or information on how many people are landing on the funnel. You'll need to integrate it with Google Analytics. You'll need to set up and make sure you're tracking the individual events because we want to look at the true data. And just so you know, it's really easy to set up. Just ask ChatGPT to be like, hey, I've got this tool and I want to integrate it with Google Analytics. Give me a full walkthrough. And you can usually get that set up in like 10 or 15 minutes. And then you're working from real data on what your conversion rates are, how many people land on that funnel, and how many people actually book a call. Those are the 2 numbers that we want to look at. So before you get building it, start by looking at what the numbers are and make sure you're tracking to see what the new numbers are going to be when we introduce this. Remember, we are testing to improve throughput of calls. If we're not seeing an improvement, something's wrong. We need to fix it. Now, to break down the components of the MVC, what I want to help you guys think about is just imagine for a second what it looks like when you usually book in on a calendar form. So usually if you're using Calendly, which is one of the tools that we have, there's going to be 2 types of pages that you've got. You've got the first page, which is going to give you the date and a bunch of times to select. And then you've got the second page, which is going to have all the questions on it, right? And then you're going to answer all of those types of questions. One thing you can add into this process, and there's something that's worth mentioning, is what's called a routing form. Now, if you typically in your offer have a lot of people that aren't super qualified, and I mean in this example, maybe someone that's not financially qualified, or maybe they're not qualified with a problem, one of the things you can add before you put in a minimum viable calendar is a routing form. A routing form comes before the date and time selection, looks exactly the same as a calendar, but you're just going to ask pre-questions. And so you might ask them their name, you might ask them their phone number, right? You're going to ask them their email. And then on top of that, you're usually going to have 1, 2, or 3 questions. In our routing form, we ask people, what's your revenue? Do you book sales calls? Right? And are you actually willing to invest? And we'll usually ask those 3 questions up front because that helps us to figure out if this person is going to be qualified for our offer. Based on what they answer, your routing form that's built into your Calendly tool can actually send them to different places. So if somebody isn't qualified, you can send them to a low ticket funnel or just tell them to fuck off somewhere different. Or you can also get people going to higher quality calendars. If you want like your very best salespeople to take your most qualified calls, you can route it through that way. You only want to use a routing form if you have got too many calls on the calendar and you've got too many of the wrong people coming through. Again, this is adding friction, and we only want to do that if you actually want to increase the quality of the calls by getting rid of non-fit people. So that's the first thing when it comes to the minimum viable calendar. This is the layout. Now, what we're going to talk about is the components of what we'll put into this calendar. So the first thing that you've got is the headline, what you say at the top. There is a component of logo, and I'll talk about this in a second. You've got your description. You've got your date and time. You've got your call to action button and what it says. This is really important, by the way. That call to action button, we got a 5% lift when we change that. And then finally, you've got the questions that come through. You have the FAQ page, which we'll talk about in a separate bit as we get to the end. So the first thing you've got, if we ignore the routing page for now, you've got your calendar. And on the top here, you've got your title, your headline. Now, most people, when you're looking at a title, are going to have something that says something along the lines of meet with Jamie, right? Book your discovery call, have your sales conversation. Very non-outcome based language. So the first thing we say with the minimum viable calendar is have the freaking outcome in the headline. And so this is very, very important because when you send an email and you have a call to action and that text that you use in the email is usually going to be the outcome. So for example, if I say to people, get booked on podcasts in my call to action, because that's the outcome maybe that we're delivering, on the next page, if it then says the same thing, get booked on podcasts with our team, there's going to be a higher likelihood that they're going to book the call. The reason for this is congruency. It doesn't matter whether you run ads, whether you send emails, or whether you're booking people in from a YouTube description, whatever your call to action is and whatever the headline is of the minimum viable calendar should be exactly the same, because a better level of congruency means that they say, oh, I'm in the right place. The thing that I just clicked is going to make sense. And so that's a very important factor that you want to have when you're looking at your headline. And so again, I'm not going to give you guys examples. We'll talk about that later. But whatever your outcome is for what you sell, put that in the headline. The next part that you've got here, the second part of your minimum viable calendar, is your description. And we usually break the description up into 3 different parts. The first one is all about setting intentions. And so this is where you're going to tell them what is actually going to happen. So this could be something along the lines of, you're going to meet with our team on a Zoom call for 60 minutes, and we're going to discuss XYZ. Just a very clear sentence or 2 sentences that says, hey, here's what you're booking in for. Here's what's going to happen next. The second thing that you want to put in this description is what we call the we will bullets, right? And I like the language we will because it's very absolute. You're saying to them, this is what we're going to do when you pay us money. And so here inside of the bullets, where you've got the we will bullets here, you're going to say inside of Media Firestorm, if you decide to buy, we will, and then we're going to list 2 or 3 bullet points of the outcomes that they are going to walk away with when investing into your program and process. So you really want to think of the 3 most valuable outcomes that people are going to get. So we might say, we're going to get you booked on 1 to 2 high quality podcasts every week. We will help you figure out the biggest bottleneck inside of your business. And 3, we'll help you install our proven back-end conversion systems like our email matrix to get you significantly more book calls and help you to scale the business over the next 12 months, right? Those are 3 bullets that we could put inside of there. The final thing you want to have inside of this description is actually your calendar availability. Now, quick caveat, the reason that we're putting calendar availability in the description is actually just a very common sales concept that's going to be important for you to have really high show rates. When you have the times that people can get booked in for on the calendar, it's really important, if you want a high show rate, for you to do no more than 2 to 3 days out on the calendar. What we've seen time and time again is that anytime you go past 2 to 3 days on the calendar, you have a significantly lower show rate. because people are booking so far out into the future that by the time they actually get onto that call, their interest level has dropped significantly. And they may have gone from curious to actually no longer interested at all, and now they are no showing on the call. And so one of the really important things that we say here is, don't have availability more than 72 hours out and have as much availability in that time frame. Now, you might need extra salespeople. You may need to rejig your calendar to make this happen, but you want to have the maximum amount of availability in the 72-hour window. And so what we put as the final thing in this description is we just tell people, hey, we only have the calendar available for 72 hours in advance. If you can't find a time on the calendar, just send us an email and let us know, and we'll be opening up more time tomorrow if you want to check back in the calendar. Right? We're letting them know, hey, just so you know, if you're only seeing 3 days out, that's intentional. That's on purpose. Now, the second part of this is all on the front page of the calendar. The second thing we're going to go into is the actual questions on the second page of the calendar, right? This is where they've picked a time, they've selected it, and now they're answering the questions. Now, this should be immediately obvious for any of you that have been doing this for a long time, but for God's sake, take an email, take a phone number. By default, a lot of these calendar apps, they don't have like a phone input inside of here. Get a phone number. You need to be able to text these leads, follow up with these leads, ideally with an iPhone and an SMS confirmation. If you're not following our Media Firestorm podcast, maybe go jump in and find that podcast episode where I talk about the #1 show rate best practices. I actually did a podcast where we talked about this and went in detail about using iMessage from your setters' phones to really make sure you get the best throughput with your sales team. But collect an email, collect a phone number, and then usually what you want to do here is just have some form of qualifying questions. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can do this. The most popular solution that we've seen out there is the BANT framework, which stands for budget, authority, need, and timing. I actually find this is nabbit. I actually find that you want to have the need first in the question, then you want to have the authority, and then after that, you really want to figure out if they've got budget. And from there, I ask the timing question. And so I'll usually put it in that order instead. And so my first question will be like, hey, why do you even need, to get booked on podcasts in the first place? After that, I might say, are you the sole decision maker? Or is there somebody else that needs to be in this conversation about marketing? Maybe I'll ask them a bit of context about their business. I'll ask them for their website, what they sell, and what price they sell it at. Right, this is how I assess need, is by understanding what they sell and who they sell it to. And then on top of that, we're going to say, hey, do you have the funds to move forward on this? And, how soon do you want to get this problem fixed? And usually when we ask these questions, we get a pretty good vibe of whether they're going to be the person that's going to move forward or not. And again, it just helps your salespeople or you as the salesperson to get better understanding of, how we can help these people into the call itself. So that's everything for the minimum viable calendar technically. You've got the headline, you've got the description where you set the intention, you've got the we will help you bullets, and then the calendar availability, making sure it's not too far out, and then you've got your qualifying questions. The other thing that's really important on this first part here is actually the button. By default, when you have this button, a lot of the time it'll say, book a call or take the next step. We've actually found that having something that says like select time, right, is actually very good rather than complete, because by changing it to something that is, non-salesy, like if you have something that says like complete booking versus select time, we've actually found that created a significant improvement in throughput. This gave us a 5% lift in improvement. So, that button there that you've got at the bottom, that's just something I would split test just to see how you can get the best improvement. Now, the final part, and this is the most important part of the minimum viable calendar, is what comes next. After you've had somebody complete the calendar booking, this is where you're going to want to route them to your FAQ page. Now, your FAQ page, your confirmation page, if you want to call it that, this is the page that is going to do all of the selling. So remember we talked about earlier how a VSL takes them from curious to kind of interested or really interested on the front end. Well, with our minimum viable calendar, we're not really doing that. We're really just getting people in when they're curious and trying to get them on the calendar. So it's really important that we have these back-end conversion systems in place to be able to take them from curious to actually becoming interested before the call. Now, we go through a lot of these inside of Media Firestorm. One of the most important things is going to be your best practices on the FAQ page. We also take podcast episodes that you've done. We call these breakout podcast clips. You can talk about these a lot on the page. These breakout podcast clips are just little clips that you've done from podcast episodes where you talk about important shit in your sales process that's going to help your customer go from curious to convicted, as well as other videos and things on this page. And this is really just designed to answer their questions and get them interested before the call. I digress. So we're going to have the FAQ page and the best practices. On top of that, we're going to have these breakout podcast clips. And even we're going to put some long-form podcast clips on this page to really help you get the best conversion possible and really raise that interest level. We're also going to want to send pre-sell emails, so emails that are going to go out before they have the call. They're going to sell them on this concept. And really our goal here is just to get as much content in front of them as possible. Now, some great best practices to use here is also to have your sales team to be sending content out to your prospects before they get onto the call as well. And again, we talk about this using iMessage and iPhones, and also making sure that the podcast episodes that you do, you're actually talking about things that your prospects want to hear in your sales process. For example, I've done a lot of podcast interviews where I've talked specifically about show rates. I've talked specifically about booking more calls. I've talked specifically about how to do a great interview. I've talked specifically about how to increase conversion by using podcast bookings. And so all of these different things that I've talked about, you can take clips from those episodes or the entire episode, and your salespeople can proactively send these to prospects ahead of the call to get them to consume it to increase their level. So again, to remind you guys here, what we are basically doing is on the front end of the marketing, we're using the minimum viable calendar to get a 2 to 3x lift on the amount of throughput of calls. And then on the back end, we're making sure that we've got these great selling systems that are actually going to convert more people by getting them to a higher level of interest. This is a lot of advanced shit that I've learned from great marketers like Jeremy Haynes, Russell Brunson, and other high-level marketers like Ian Stanley over the years. It doesn't really matter what you do. What's important is that you actually put this content in front of customers for you to be able to get them to a higher level of interest. Again, we need to have competent conversion systems to get people over the line. And the final thing I want to talk about is if you're coming in here and you're actually doing maybe a couple of mil, you're somewhere from 1 to 5 mil a year, maybe a little bit higher than that. The other thing that I would really encourage you to think about here is actually testing different conversion systems. So say right now, you've got a video sales letter, right? That's your main call funnel that you're using. Well, it's not a bad idea in your emails to actually test out a minimum viable calendar alongside your video sales letter. When you've got these two different types of conversion mechanisms, you're usually going to attract and get different types of people who are going to go through the call process. There are a lot of people who need to see a video beforehand, but there are also a lot of people who won't book a call because you have a video. And so one of the things that we also encourage people to test, especially if you're doing more than a couple of 100K a month, it's a really good idea to test these different conversion mechanisms and even add multiple other conversion mechanisms in on the back end. For example, we've tested doing once a month webinars. We've tested video sales letters, minimum viable calendars. The more conversion mechanisms you have for the same amount of traffic, you can usually get more throughput inside of there. So if you're doing a couple mil a year, it's not a bad idea to throw in one of these minimum viable calendars just to test it out and see if you get more throughput, a different kind of customer. Just make sure you set up separate tracking for it. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Go test out a minimum viable calendar, see if it gets a throughput inside of your business. And if you want help knowing exactly how to set these minimum viable calendars up with our SOPs and training, and actually getting my help to install not just the calendar itself, but all of the back-end conversion systems, like the right emails, the breakout podcast clips, and all of the best practices on your FAQ page to get people actually converting and getting people excited before that call, go check out Media Firestorm down below in the description. Drop a like if this was fun, and we'll see you on the next one.